Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mr. Kinzer. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
I'm Stephen Kinzer. I'm the author of a number of books, including some about the role of the United States in the world. I write the international affairs column for the Boston Globe, and I'm a professor of international relations at Brown University.
When you talk about, talking about some of your books when it comes to the history of the government, you tackled a subject for a lot of people that's more conspiratorial area, but it's real stuff, and that's MK Ultra. And I'm just curious, why'd you start writing about MK Ultra? You started talking about Sidney Gottlieb.
There is a backstory. How did I get interested in this guy? Particularly because this guy is totally unknown. He lived in the deepest anonymity. And so effectively, I was setting out to write a biography of a person who didn't exist, a person that was invisible. So it was very difficult. But how did I get on the project? It's an interesting story, actually. I had written a book about the American Cold War policies during the 1950s that focused on John Foster Dulles, who was then the Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, who was at the same time head of the CIA. That book was called The Brothers. And in that book, I talk about a number of covert operations that the Dulles brothers directed or were involved with in some way. One of those took place in the Congo. In 1960, the CIA sent poison to the Congo to be used to kill the prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. So I included this story briefly in my book about the Dulles brothers. But it stuck with me, even though I'd only spent maybe a page on it. I began to think about that story more. It was very intriguing. So the first thing I asked myself was, who would carry poison made by the CIA to another country on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean with the goal of using that poison to kill the leader of that country? Would it be a courier or some person specially designated? Actually, I find out, no, it was not a courier. The person who carried that poison was actually the CIA officer who made it. And that was Sidney Gottlieb, who was head of the chemical division of the CIA at that time, and had spent several years running this MK Ultra project. So I figured out that it was Gottlieb who carried the poison. And he brought it to the CIA station chief in the Congo and told him, this is for you to use to poison the prime minister. By his own account, the CIA station chief replied, Jesus Christ, who ordered this operation? And Gottlieb said, President Eisenhower. So that was interesting to me. And then I discovered that this very little known person, Sidney Gottlieb, had actually been called to testify in Washington in front of a Senate hearing on assassinations. It turned out that Gottlieb had made all the poisons that the CIA ever used. He was the chief poison maker, and that's why I call my book Poisoner in Chief. He made poisons to kill Fidel Castro. You read all those stories about the poison cigars and the poison pills and the poison wetsuit. All of that was made by Sidney Gottlieb. The poison pills that were given to American agents in other countries to kill themselves in case they were in trouble, made by Sidney Gottlieb. The poison pill that was given to the U-2 pilot that was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, made by Sidney Gottlieb. And so that was the question that the senators were asking him. What was your involvement in these assassination plots? But as I read through the testimony, I realized that in that situation, making poisons to kill people, Gottlieb was essentially just a pharmacist. if somebody else hadn't been there, if he hadn't been there, someone else would have done it. So that didn't seem so important to me. But then I slowly came to realize from a few references that actually Gottlieb had a whole other project. And in a way, although the making of the poisons was spectacular, this other project was far more important and more interesting, and that was MK Ultra. Sidney Gottlieb was the founder and sole director for its entire life of this project, MK Ultra, designed to discover the secret of mind control. As the director of this project, he carried out the most extreme and intense experiments ever conducted by any agent or agency of the US government. He had what amounted to a license to kill. He could go to foreign countries and ask for prisoners or other people to be turned over to him that he could experiment on, and in some cases, experiment to death. So I came to conclude that Sidney Gottlieb might well have been the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. I'm always interested in untold stories. And I came to realize that MK Ultra really is one of those. And in a way, Gottlieb got away with just saying he was the CIA's poison maker, which was a technical job. But MK Ultra was different. It all came out of Gottlieb's mind. It was him who did it. If he were not there, it might have been totally different. So I began to focus on Gottlieb and this amazing MK Ultra project, and that became the genesis of the book Poisoner in Chief.
When we talk about Gottlieb, what was the first thing that the CIA saw him to be this potential candidate to just be involved in everything? I mean, you have a guy that's creating poisons for Castro, or these poisons to kill Castro, all these things that are a part of our society. Everyone knows, like assassination attempts and, cyanide pills and all these types of things that get used in spy tactics. But you don't, when you look up his Wikipedia, there's a little bit about him, but it never tells you all this. It never gives you all this information. So you have a person that's very involved in a lot of the dark part of our history, but no record, no trace. No, he's not even paying a crime or anything for any of the stuff that he did, unethical experiments during MK Ultra. I'm just curious, what was the CIA just didn't pick a random pharmacist? There was something about him that got him involved.
So the CIA, and in particular, the person who was about to become its director, Alan Dulles, who ran it for most of the 1950s, was fascinated by the idea of mind control. In fact, they were not just fascinated, they were terrified, because having misinterpreted a couple of events in the world, they became convinced that the Soviets or the Chinese communists had discovered this secret of mind control, and that if this was true, then the United States was in great danger. On the other hand, if the CIA could find the secret of mind control, the prize could be nothing less than global mastery. So the CIA decided it needed to consolidate its various mind control projects, which were kind of scattered and not directly coordinated. And they needed one person to do it. So they needed a person who was a scientist, and Gottlieb had his PhD in chemistry. So they sought him out, and I think there was another reason. There were plenty of other smart young scientists out there. Why did they pick Gottlieb in particular? Well, he had been working with several government agencies. He was sort of known in that small community in Washington. But I think there might have been another reason that Gottlieb was appealing, and it had to do with his personal background. So at that time, in the early 50s, Gottlieb joined the CIA in 1951. The CIA was made up almost entirely of people from the same social class. It was this real elitist group of East Coast rich kids. So these early CIA officers, and Alan Dulles definitely fits into this category, were people who had grown up with great privilege. They knew each other from prep schools, from college, from the investment banks and law firms that they went to work for. They were a rich elite, and they saw manipulating the world as the fun and essential game of their era. But Sidney Gottlieb was not like that. He was completely different from all this other senior CIA officers. He was Jewish, and the parents were Jewish immigrants. So he grew up in essentially an immigrant household. He had a limp. He stuttered. He was a person who, under most circumstances, would not have been recruited by the CIA. So why did they pick someone who was so different from the rest of them? I don't know, but I have a theory. I think what they thought was, whoever we hire for this job is going to have to do some really awful things. He's going to be essentially a torturer, and he might have to kill people. It's going to be really ugly. We don't want to mess our fingers with that kind of filth. So what we want to do is we want to hire somebody who's different from us. Tell him to go ahead and do everything that he thinks he needs to do, and don't report back. Just go out and do whatever you think is necessary. And if something goes wrong, if material about this project somehow filters out, or if later on some of it gets discovered, we can always say it was all Sidney. That way you get rid of the responsibility of the institution. And indeed, this is what happened. Years later, in the 1970s, a CIA director told some relatives of one of Gottlieb's victims, there was a lack of supervision in those days. Some of our people were out of control. So it worked. It was exactly what they had planned to do. In case material about MK Ultra comes out, we can say, hey, we had one crazy guy. We didn't know what he was doing. Wasn't it awful? And I think they thought about that at the beginning and realized we can throw this guy under the bus because he's not one of us. If it's one of us that's doing it, it's going to be more complicated, and it's very distasteful. So an outsider would be the best person to do it. I think that's part of the reason they found and fixated on Sidney Gottlieb and made him the director of that MK Ultra project.
What were some of the experiments of MK Ultra that stuck out in your mind? I've come across a couple, like dealing with auditory or, some types of things to cut off people's, like, I guess, sight and their hearing a little bit. Like, I think I read a story about a guy that felt like he was lying in a hole and they were dumping snakes on top of him. But I don't know if they gave him a drug, but they cut off his vision and they cut off his hearing. They put headphones on him. So he didn't know what was going on, and the overall sensation he was feeling from his, sense of touch, he thought they were snakes. I don't necessarily know if they were snakes. I don't remember that much about it, but it's this manipulative tactic. I mean, it's not crazy to think of using drugs to, bend someone's reality. I think it was Joyon West. If you read his Wikipedia, he works for the CIA, but one thing he's credited for was brainwashing or hypnotizing people that were brainwashed from the Korean War. And what was happening was these soldiers thought that the Korea War, they hypnotized them to think that we used biological weapons, which were against the Geneva Convention. So Joylon West would go in there and unhypnotize them, be like, oh no, those were planted memories in you. Those aren't real. Well, it turns out that we know now we did use biological weapons over there. And what he was doing was making them forget what they had done over there.
So Gottlieb was a scientist, and he launched MK Ultra with a scientist's perspective. He had been told he could do whatever he wanted, but he had to focus on this question: how do we crack this age-old secret, control people's minds? So as a scientist, the first thing he thought of was an overall concept, and it was this: before you can figure out how to insert a new mind into someone's brain, you first have to figure out how to destroy the mind that's in there. And that's when Gottlieb set off on these horrific experiments. He wanted to find out, how do you destroy a human mind, a human soul, a human body? Now, the next step he took was also very logical for a scientist. He decided, I want to go find out what research is already out there so I can build on it. So who knows about these things? Who knows how people respond to torture, or having their bodies sliced up in different ways, or being given certain intense drugs? Those are kinds of things that nobody in America knew about, but he figured out very quickly. There were people who knew that stuff. And they were the doctors who had worked in the Nazi concentration camps and their counterparts in Japan, who in some cases had carried out intensely grotesque, murderous experiments, even more brutal than the ones in the concentration camps.
Unit 731. Unit 731.
Exactly. So Gottlieb went out and recruited these people. And the science that the Japanese and the Nazis had discovered during the Second World War by torturing unknown numbers of people to death became the vital information on which MK Ultra was based. So he recruited these Nazi scientists and their Japanese counterparts to share the information that they had and to offer suggestions about how we could go further. Now, while I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I went to Germany, where Gottlieb did a lot of work, and I discovered what I think may have been the very first CIA secret prison. It's a beautiful chalet in what was a forest, now kind of a suburb outside of Frankfurt. I went to that house and I met the young entrepreneur who had just bought it. He was turning it into condos. It's a lovely spot. It looks like it could be a B&B. And he was very open. He said, first of all, everybody in this neighborhood knows what happened in this house. They've told me. And they told me that the bodies of the people that were killed in Gottlieb's experiments were buried in the forests around here, in places that are now turned into shopping malls and apartment blocks. And then he took me into the basement and he showed me his storage rooms. And he says, these rooms were the cells where the CIA MK Ultra operatives, along with their Nazi counterparts, carried out these horrific experiments, which were actually just continuations of the experiments that the Nazi doctors had conducted in concentration camps just down the road, only a few years earlier. So what did these experiments consist of? Sensory deprivation, to which you referred, of making people, locking people in a coffin and having them lose all sense of the outside world, was a piece of it. But that wasn't enough. Gottlieb used all sorts of combinations of drugs to try to put people in states that were so extreme that they would lose their minds. For example, he carried out a series of experiments in which people were given massive overdoses of sedatives and put into what was essentially almost a comatose state. Then they would be injected with massive doses of amphetamines to make them hyperactive. And while they were in the transition phase between comatose and hyperactive, he would apply electroshock to try to intensify the effect. He used all sorts of drug combinations and all sorts of other kinds of techniques to try to solve this riddle of destroying a mind. Now, we don't know so much about the experiments because Gottlieb destroyed all the records of MK Ultra with the blessing of the CIA director when he left the agency. But some details have emerged. I can tell you one example. Gottlieb was fascinated with LSD. In fact, he was the first LSD maven. In 1953, Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. And that's what it did. It bought it from the Sandoz laboratory in Switzerland, brought it to the United States, and Gottlieb used it in a whole series of experiments. He was fascinated with LSD and the potential of LSD to be able to open the mind to interrogators and break down resistance. So here's one experiment that we do know about. Gottlieb liked to use prisoners inside the United States. He wasn't able to kill his subjects in the United States the way he could in other countries. But he did the closest thing to it. So here's one experiment that he conducted at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. He had 7 African-American inmates segregated and fed what the administering doctor called triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. You can only imagine what effect this might have had. Now, that was part, presumably, of Gottlieb's desire to figure out if you could destroy a human mind with this kind of overdose. We don't know the answer, but I'm going to guess the answer is yes. Probably it worked. And I've often wondered about those 7 inmates. So, did they ever realize what happened to them? Did they ever recover their wits? Were they released? We'll never know. And that's an example of how frustrating it is to be writing about MK Ultra. In my books, everything is documented, everything is footnoted. I like books that speculate, but I don't write that kind of book. So I've had to rely on the piecemeal reports that have come out in various ways, and plus my own research, and try to piece together the story of this bizarre project and the equally bizarre person, Sidney Gottlieb, who ran it.
When you talked about your personal research, did you file FOIA requests? What did you do personal research wise? Because I know from hearing Tom O'Neill talk about it, like he would request files for Joy on West, and they would say, we cannot say or dismiss if this is real, or if we have the files, we just can't give you access to these. They're secret documents. And then I've went on the CIA.gov and typed in Joy on West. No results found, but Wikipedia has him labeled for working for the CIA. So I go, okay, well, the CIA says there's no documents on him, so I guess he doesn't, and Wikipedia must be lying, right? Nope, I found him stamped at the bottom right of every single one of Jack Ruby's psychiatric records. And I'm like, well, he exists. He's not a fictional character. He exists. But the documents, when you say like destroyed documents, people go, well, that's just so you don't have to show your proof. And it's like, we only know MK Ultra exists because they found a bunch of other documents in a warehouse that don't even talk about the experiments. They talk about other things like buying and what they use, not necessarily the specifics of what was bought, but just like transcripts and stuff of that sort.
So we do have, thanks to warehousing divisions at the CIA, a list of the so-called sub-projects that Gottlieb administered. There were over 100 of them. And other pieces of information have surfaced in different ways. Some people who have been victims of MK Ultra did come to realize what had happened to them and have told their stories. I did file Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA for information about Gottlieb. I didn't receive much, although finally, after the hardcover edition was published, I received his redacted personnel file. So I talk about that in my paperback edition, but there isn't so much in there. There were some interesting pieces that helped fill in some blanks. But the most interesting thing is kind of a footnote that I got from the CIA was a photograph. So Gottlieb lived in total anonymity. Nobody knew that he existed, much less what he looked like. So I wanted to get a photo. What does Sidney Gottlieb look like when he worked for the CIA? Nobody had ever seen such a photo. So I did make that request to the CIA. And to my surprise, they finally agreed and they released a couple of photos of him. And so I was very excited about this. And I called the publisher of my book and I said, you're not going to believe what happened. I just got pictures of Sidney Gottlieb. So we've got our cover now. We're going to have Gottlieb finally on the cover. And he said, oh, congratulations. That sounds great. About an hour later, I got an email from him saying, wait, stop. We changed our mind. I've talked to people in here and we now all agree that the idea of putting that photo on the cover is not good because nobody will recognize him. It won't mean anything. And so what they did instead on the cover is they just drew a black outline, like a profile, silhouette of an unknown person. And in a way, I think maybe that's even better because that reflects what Gottlieb was during his lifetime, a totally unknown individual. And essentially what he had remained up until Poisoner in Chief came out.
I got to know the feeling. What was it like you researching this guy for so long and then finally getting an image of him to be able to put, the work to the face?
writing this book was difficult. So as you can see around me, this is my little office. It's a small room. And when you're a biographer, you're effectively living with the person you're writing about. You're totally immersed in that person's life. This is a small room for just two people, me and Sidney Gottlieb. And it was pretty intense. My wife had asked me to please stop telling stories at the end of the day. And what I found out, it's just too awful. I don't want to hear this before we have dinner. So I was spending my days going through these horrific reports and trying to figure out exactly which ones were true and how I could put them together in a book. Um, I think I probably came to know more about Sidney Gottlieb than any living human outside of his own family. That's not saying much, since most people didn't know anything about him or even the fact of his existence. Getting a photo of him was a really interesting experience. I'd already come to feel like I knew him, and I knew him well. And I had some photos of him from later on. There were a couple taken when he testified in front of the Senate, and I found his college yearbook photo. That was another little tip. But yeah, the photos really do give you a sense of that the person actually existed. You can really put your fingers on it. And until that photo arrived, I felt like the story was still a little incomplete. So it was a good rush, but that only sustained me for a few minutes until I was delving back into the horrors that constitute the life story of Sidney Gottlieb.
When you were going through and doing all your research on him, did you notice a change in his personality, like from when he started to where, it kind of ended, or where you stopped researching into his work? Like, I'm not saying, I'm not asking the question, like, did he feel remorse at any point? But I just feel like you have to get numb to the amount of experiments that you start doing, where it's not really like you're experimenting on a person anymore. And the way that you've explained it seems like he was just more focused into like, this is research. This is great research. Um,
So Sidney Gottlieb never spoke after his retirement about MK Ultra. He was asked, but he kept saying, "That's in the past. It's going to stay there. I'm not going to talk about it." So his personality, his feelings are things we can only speculate on. However, there are some things we do know about Gottlieb's life, and they're fascinating. So Gottlieb did not live like every other federal civil servant in Washington in the 1950s. He lived a completely different life. He lived in a little, what we would call today, an eco house in the Virginia woods. It didn't have running water because he thought that was environmentally unsound. He grew his own vegetables. He got up before dawn to milk his goats. He wrote poetry. He studied Zen Buddhism. He was like a proto-hippie. And so that makes it all the stranger that this super gentle soul who was beloved by all his neighbors and wanted to be nice to nature and his neighbors and his friends and his family and was a great community figure. How could that person also be the most prolific American torturer of his generation? How do you put these two things together? For a while, I started to imagine him driving home from the CIA headquarters, which were then in Washington, D.C., right across from where the Kennedy Center is now, back to his place in Virginia. Did he kind of shed a personality the way a snake would shed a skin as he crossed over the Potomac and then headed for his beautiful family, and then became the gentle, loving person that his friends and family knew? I think it might be a little deeper than that. How would a person who had such compassion and thought of himself as a highly moral person come to commit these horrific crimes? I think you might explain it this way. And again, this is speculation, but here's
Wait,
what I imagine might
he
have
took
gone.
his work hat off or something? He took his work hat
Something
off?
like that.
Yeah.
I think of it this way. You have to put yourself back in the climate of the times. In the early and mid 50s, America was living under the terror of what we were told was an imminent Soviet attack that would not only destroy America, but make all meaningful life on Earth impossible. Um, were fed a terrifying image of the Soviet Union and what it might be like to try to live in a country after the Soviet Union had captured the United States. It was so horrific that Americans came to believe there was nothing that was too excessive to protect us from such a danger, which was more than a danger of death, but a danger of the extinction of all possibility of meaningful life on Earth. So Gottlieb might have had this thought: I live a kind of strange life. I'm an individualist. I don't fit in to the way most people live. And I can do that because I live in a free and open society. After we are captured and subjugated by the Soviets, it will not be possible for anyone to live the kind of life I live. Everything will be regimented. Everybody will be turned into a slave of power. And therefore, the danger is so immense that the loss of a few lives or even a few hundred lives would seem like a very small price to pay. So I'm imagining that this is what Gottlieb thought. I do find a quote in one of his testimonies in which he says, I want you to know that I always found this work very difficult, very challenging, although it was very necessary. So he certainly didn't insulate himself from the horrors that he was inflicting on others. But he had a way to justify it to himself. And I think it must have been because it had such a role in defending America. Years later, when he met someone who was looking into his past, although he didn't give any specific answers, he said, you have to remember, I had the security of this country in my hands. If you extrapolate from that, you can feel that he had what he felt was a justification. Patriotism is one of the greatest justifications that people reach to in order to justify horrific acts. And that's, I think, what Gottlieb did. He thought that he had to do things that looked awful, and that might be why he never wanted to talk about them afterward, but actually were necessary. And when a reporter called his widow after he died and asked for an interview, she refused to talk to him. And she said, you can never understand who he was. And I think what she might have meant was, it's going to look awful when you see what he did, but you have to understand the larger picture to understand what a great guy he was, and you won't get that. So I'm not going to talk to you. I think there was a sense that these were things he felt he had to do. And in the end, they worked, because America was not attacked and destroyed by the Soviet Union. However, at the end of the MK Ultra project, which lasted for years, Gottlieb concluded there's no such thing as mind control. You cannot seize control of a person's mind and make him do things like commit murder that he's deeply opposed to. So essentially what he's saying is, oh, forget all that. It didn't work. Never mind. So all of his years of research produced not only no breakthrough in mind control, but a conclusion that the whole thing was a myth and that they had been essentially made to believe something that wasn't true. And I can tell you, when I was doing my book tour, giving speeches about this book, I mentioned this fact, and then I said he realized that you can't really brainwash someone. That's just in movies. And the first question came from actually one of my colleagues at Brown. She had a great observation. It wasn't a question. She said, I want to correct or challenge one of the things you said. You said that Gottlieb actually never managed to brainwash anyone. But that really isn't true, because based on your speech, I'm thinking he did brainwash one person. He brainwashed himself into believing that just a few more experiments and a few more tortures might be the breakthrough, and then we would find mind control. So in a sense, he controlled his own mind and distorted it to the point where he thought that things that screenwriters and novelists could imagine were actually true.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but this one's going to be might be a tough one. Has your thought on just the government in general changed? Like, I consider myself a patriot, but I know about a lot of this MK Ultra stuff, and I'm not rationalizing any of that. But I just think it's like if you look at like what you just said about him kind of brainwashing himself, that's a lot of these figures that are involved in some of the worst things ever. It's like they seem like they're not really mad with power like you would see a corrupt villain in a movie. It's more like they're seeing it differently than how you're supposed to see it, I guess, from a more personal aspect. They're seeing it from a strictly strategic, like more, I don't know how to really explain it, I guess. It just, they brainwash themselves in a sense to do these things and be able to live with themselves. I mean, if you can imagine Gottlieb becoming a different person when he gets home. I mean, think about eating pea soup and you're hearing the screams of these victims that are tripping on LSD. I mean, that's a hard thing to deal with. But obviously, from what you just told me, he's seeing it a little bit differently. But Alan Dulles, I mean, the actions he took on some things can be justified as someone that seems like I'll do what others won't do to make sure America's safe. I mean, is that necessarily right? No, but that's what he's kind of told himself in a sense.
It's a moral calculus. And people at the CIA used to like to say things like intelligence work is not to be confused with the Boy Scouts. So I think they did have a united view that the very survival of human freedom on Earth was at stake every single day. You didn't know when the Soviets would charge across Germany, and within 24 hours they'd be at the English Channel, and next thing you know, nuclear missiles are raining down on the United States. If you convince yourself that that's true, and everybody in the early CIA in the 1950s believed that, then it's hard to imagine anything that would seem to be too far to go. It shows you the danger of buying into a national narrative. Probably the Cold War was the most potent and successful national narrative in our history. It shaped everything. And it certainly shaped Gottlieb. Gottlieb also had been rejected for military service during the Second World War because of his limp. And this made him feel like he hadn't done his part. And he wanted to compensate by showing his patriotism, showing that he was willing to do whatever was necessary. So I think he's really a poster child for the idea that whatever you do is moral if it's on behalf of a moral cause. And then you can always convince yourself that your cause is moral.
When it comes to Alan Dulles' involvement, or just in contact with Sidney, did they have a close relationship at all, or was it strictly a business kind of relationship? It seemed like Alan Dulles is the type. I mean, I know his son, when he came back from war, he signed him up for the MK Ultra project. So I'm just curious if Alan Dulles was just this figure that liked what was going on and wanted to know more and be in on all the cool experimentation stuff, is how he views it, or was it strictly a business relationship?
Alan Dulles was the godfather of MK Ultra. He's the one that gave it its name because it was the Ultra project. It was by far the most important thing the CIA was working on. Imagine what it would mean for the CIA to have an instrument by which it could control the minds of, say, foreign leaders. So Alan Dulles, the CIA director during the 1950s, was completely supportive of this project. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that he was fascinated with the experiments and wanted to know about it. In fact, the opposite was true. At the CIA, and I believe also in other secret services, there's not a desire to know everything. In fact, ignorance can be an asset. You don't want to know everything that's going on, particularly when you realize that the information you would get would be information about horrific tortures and tortures to death. So I don't think Alan Dulles ever sat in on any MK Ultra meetings. I don't think he was informed more than in a general way of what happened. One of his closest aides, Richard Helms, who later became CIA director himself, was effectively Sidney Gottlieb's godfather or rabbi at the CIA. And I think he would have heard some summaries as much as he wanted of what Gottlieb was doing. But and that would have certainly been passed up the ladder. Allen Dulles had regular lunches with his brother, who was Secretary of State. His brother used to talk to the president several times a day, go to see him almost every day. So some general outlines of this would have been known to Eisenhower, to John Foster Dulles, and to Allen Dulles at the CIA. But they didn't want to know anymore. This way, they could later say he was out of control. We just didn't supervise him well enough. So Allen Dulles, I believe, intentionally segregated himself from any knowledge about MK Ultra beyond the fact that it was ongoing, that it was intense, and that Gottlieb seemed to be the man they wanted. So he really was, in this case, an example of how the higher up you go in the CIA, the less people want to know about things that they know are awful. This makes the CIA so different from, say, a corporation or a university or any other institution. Normally, if you're supervising a person who you know is involved in very dicey operations, you'd want to supervise that person especially closely. At the CIA, it's the opposite. The more horrific the person's projects are, the less the higher ups want to know about it. And I think that really gave Gottlieb completely free reign to do whatever he wanted. That takes me back to what I said at the beginning of our chat, which is that you want to have somebody on whom you can blame everything if things go wrong. And although Allen Dulles and Gottlieb certainly knew each other and they spoke regularly, Dulles would have insulated himself from those details because he knew they were awful. And that's a great example of how the CIA and these other operations work. Now, you asked me about his personality changing. When he retired, he became even more intensely involved in community activities. He was on the planning board. He acted in Christmas plays. He spent time working at a leper colony in India. He worked out his humanitarian instincts. But I found a woman who was the rabbi in that community where he lived, and she said that she had tried to draw him out about MK Ultra, and she said he said he wanted to talk about it, but whenever you asked, he would shut down. And she said maybe it was because at his advanced age, he was as baffled about what he had done as we, who were finding out about it, were. So I think he, having taken LSD himself, by his own account, more than 200 times, must have had some reflections in his later years about what he had done and whether it was worthwhile. But we have no evidence that he ever regretted anything.
Do you ever speculate that maybe he might have brainwashed himself to forget some of the things that he did?
Whether that, it depends on how you define brainwashing. Did he have a specific routine or a set of practices that would actually make him forget things? Or did he just have a mindset in which he was able to compartmentalize things in an extreme way and put it aside? During one of his depositions that I discovered from a lawyer who had them stuck in his garage, he was asked, did you ever discuss MK Ultra with anybody? And he said, I often discussed it with my wife. Maybe that's the reason why later on she refused to talk. And actually, here's another detail. After Gottlieb died, he had 4 children. They were all adults by then. The widow, their mother, called them together and made them all promise never to speak to anyone about their father. Now, of course, this was never made public. That was just a family discussion. But while I was writing Poisoner in Chief, I had this idea. I want to find the grown-up children of Sidney Gottlieb. That would be a logical place to go. And I started sending emails, and I focused on one guy who was the older son. He had become quite prominent. He wrote a book. He was the state archivist of Wisconsin. So I sent him emails, certified letters, tried to phone him. I never got a response. And I was about to go out to Wisconsin and doorstop and just sit there until I could grab him, until I found a person who was very close to the family who told me this story and said, don't bother to go find him because they've all promised never to speak about him. That just deepens the mystery.
Good God, the stories his wife must have heard when he comes home from work. I would pay so much money just to hear a couple of those stories, man. That's insane to keep that secret, have that balance in your head if you're doing like book club or something, and all your friends are talking about how their husband had a great day or something, and you're just like, you don't know what I have in my head from the stories I hear.
And of course, she was a widow for 10 years. So she had 10 years to work it through in her mind and to keep her mouth very closed.
Um, I asked about Alan Dulles and his kid and MK Ultra. Did you look into that at all about him signing his kid up?
Um, I don't know if the son was signed up for MK Ultra. So the son, Alan Macy Dulles, uh, always felt that his father didn't approve of him. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't tough enough. And so when the Korean War broke out, he signed up. He joined the Marines so he could go out and be a fighter. And he was severely injured. He suffered severe brain injuries in an artillery attack. Alan Dulles tried all kinds of doctors and all kinds of techniques to try rehabilitation. The son really never recovered his entire life. He lived in either institutions or under care of others. So it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that Alan Dulles, in his search for treatments for his son, which was quite extensive, he would have turned to the doctors at MK Ultra, with some of whom he was very close, and maybe some of the techniques that some of those experimenters had developed could have been thought useful in treating the son. I don't have any evidence of that, but the fate of young Alan Dulles is a really sad side part of the story of that remarkable family.
Man, I look, Mr. Kinzer, I appreciate the time you given me to be able to chat on my show. I have to ask, if you were going to choose any other topic besides diving into MK Ultra, or just the history of the CIA or Alan Dulles, any of that, what would have been your choice? Would you choose like a Bob Ross style thing where it was like more of the opposite angle of like the dark history part?
I'm interested in real history, so there's a footnote for every paragraph and every quote in all my books. I find the story of the Cold War endlessly fascinating. How were Americans effectively brainwashed, if we want to use that word, to adopt, and embrace this narrative? It's really something that is difficult to grasp. I teach about the Cold War at Brown, and I always start by talking about how important it is to try to put yourself back in the mindset of that era. But no matter how often I say that, I think that even I cannot put myself fully back in that mindset. People were looking at a clock. It was every morning printed in the newspaper how many minutes it was going to take for a Soviet atomic bomb to reach the United States. And it would be 47 minutes. Then it would be down to 42 minutes and 40 minutes. These things would terrify people. Going to bomb shelters during air raid alerts was legally required. You had to go down into your basement or stop your work or not be on the streets whenever the sirens went off. So people really did begin to think that war was a real possibility. In fact, that it was instant annihilation and it was right around the corner. Now, you asked me about placing this in the context of other work that I've done and how it affected me. I'll tell you this. I've written 10 books, and I've discovered a lot of material that was very surprising to me, particularly material about the CIA and the US role in the world. And it's material that shocked a lot of readers. But this is the first time I have really been shocked. I still can't wrap my mind around the fact that there was such a thing as MK Ultra and there was such a person as Sidney Gottlieb. The more you learn about it, the more astonishing it is that this story could have unfolded. And it's definitely the story that has shocked me. Really, it's the only story that has ever really shocked me. I've been everywhere in the world. I've seen wars. I've seen everything. But this one was even stunning to me. And I'm still recovering.
When I talking to so many JFK experts, there's always and I'm looking through documents from the CIA website, the archives, all this. There's always this labeled word of communism, and I was like, I need to understand what this is because from my generation, I don't know this fear or what it was back then. I guess what I could relate to is maybe when COVID first happened, that fear, like everyone was going to be like a Thanos snap. You're going to lose half the people you knew, and back then you start reading about communism and everyone acting and doing all these actions under communism just to be able to understand what it was. And the media hyped it up to this point where it seemed like, buy a bomb shelter now because you're not going to be around tomorrow. And like that can cause people to do unrational things, can make unreasonable purchases, can do a bunch of different stuff, and it only adds context to the times. I mean, our history books tell us one thing, and MK Ultra is something that really doesn't get told, and not a lot of people even know if it even was real. It is. And I think like for me, you have to understand when you accept history, it's kind of like you get the Superman version, but understand the real version is Superman smokes cigarettes and he's a bit of a drinker. Like you just gotta have to accept that a little bit too. Where I ended up finding like, the Cold War, I'm really interested in history right now. It's a fascinating subject.
The boogeyman of communism was built up far beyond the level of an alien or hostile ideology. It was thought to be the latest incarnation of the force of barbarism that has always threatened civilization since the Huns overran Rome thousands of years ago. It was thought of as a force determined to destroy the possibility of all meaningful life on Earth and turn every human being into an automaton, a slave. And the Cold War legacy is still out there. I was fascinated to read just the other day that the Florida governor, DeSantis, who is said to be a leading candidate to be our next president, wants to mandate that Florida schools teach a course in the evils of communism. That's today in 2022. It still resonates as a great boogeyman. And you can still demonize anyone by using that word. Oh, that sounds like communism to me. Nobody really knows what that is, but it's just the worst thing on earth and beyond anything evil that you could imagine. Our ignorance of the communist world naturally contributed to this. But in any case, the fear, the terror of communism deeply infiltrated the minds and hearts of Americans for years, particularly during the 1950s. That was the period when MK Ultra was at its peak, and that helps explain it.
Well, Mr. Kinzer, I appreciate you giving me your time to chat on my show. Is there a place where people can find your books and any other links you'd like to promote at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram?
I do have my own website, which is stephenkinzer.com, and there's all my articles I write every couple of weeks, plus links to my books. All of my books are available on Amazon, so go look at the website and then go out and buy them from your local independent dealer. And I do have a Twitter feed at Stephen Kinzer, so check me out.
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode.